All right, does the defense wish to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court, counsel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to start by reintroducing myself because jury selection was a long time ago, and that was the last time I think that my name was mentioned. My name is Danny Hernandez, and I am representing Mr. Ritchie as well, and I'm the one that's going to be handling this portion of the case. I want to begin also by saying that your verdict is totally respected. We're not here in this part of there may be disagreements, but there's in no way going to be any dispute with your verdict. It's being respected, and we're now moving on to, as the state indicated, the penalty phase that we talked about during jury selection. Despite the guilty verdict that you have rendered, you indicated during jury selection that you would consider other factors before voting for a life sentence or for a death sentence. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that there are significant mitigating factors that point to life imprisonment as the appropriate sentence in this case. The aggravating factors suggested by the state are part of the facts that you already have considered in arriving at your guilty verdict. In the next day or so, the defense will be presenting additional information, additional evidence for your consideration. And that evidence has nothing to do with the issue of guilt or innocence. The defense will be presenting evidence that can be classified as mitigating circumstances or factors. You will hear that Mr. Ritchie was born and raised in Jamaica. It's an understatement to say that he had a very difficult childhood. He was subjected to physical and emotional abuse growing up. He was raised in an extremely high crime, violent area of Kingston, the capital of Jamaica. So much violence and crime in that area that the area is practically inaccessible to outsiders. Despite this, ironically, you will hear, and it's a fact that's stipulated by the state and the defense, that the defendant has no prior felony convictions, despite being raised in this environment. As the state indicated, you will see a video filmed in Jamaica containing several people that know him, testimonials, people that know Mr. Ritchie, friends and family of Mr. Ritchie. They will talk about him and his childhood and him as a person. You will see, ladies and gentlemen, that there is a lot more to the Granville Ritchie story than what happened on the day the victim was murdered. And I want to stress at this point that anything that is presented in mitigation is not in any way trying to minimize what happened, but these are the factors that will be presented to you during this portion of the case. You will hear about head injuries suffered by Mr. Ritchie prior to the murder, as a child, in fact. This is where the experts come in. A forensic neuropsychologist, Dr. Hyman Eisenstein, examined, tested, and evaluated Mr. Ritchie and will testify about his findings and opinions. Now, this is a neuropsychologist who spent many hours with Mr. Ritchie at the jail. So his findings and conclusions are based on many hours of evaluation. One of his opinions was, and by the way, part of the evaluation is not just running psychological tests, but it's also interviewing him and interviewing other people that know Mr. Ritchie. But one of his opinions was recommending a PET scan and an MRI conducted because he, Dr. Eisenstein, identified evidence of possible brain injury. Subsequently, Mr. Ritchie was given these tests, and the results were reviewed and interpreted by another expert who happens to be Dr. Joseph Wu, who is a neuropsychiatrist who will testify as well. And they his testimony would confirm evidence of brain abnormalities. These are people, Dr. Wu basically reviews the test and renders his opinions based on the test, but keep in mind, Dr. Eisenstein, the neuropsychologist, spent many hours with Mr. Ritchie before testifying here later this morning. Finally, you will hear from a prison, he's a former law enforcement corrections officer who can be sort of referred to as a prison expert by the name of Aubrey Land, who will testify about prison life and Mr. Ritchie's adaptability to serving a life sentence. And you will hear about that also with Dr. Eisenstein, about his adaptability to serve a life sentence without causing other problems at the jail. In the end, the defense expects to present the following mitigating factors, in addition to anything else that might surface in the course of the testimony for your consideration. That, as I've indicated, the defendant has no prior felony record. He has no significant history of prior criminal activity. Also, the capital felony was committed while the defendant was under the influence of extreme mental or emotional disturbance. The capacity of the defendant to appreciate the criminality of his or her conduct, to the requirements of law was substantially impaired. Also, the defendant suffered a significant head injury as a child, which I've referred to already, but received little or no medication and continues to have migraines afterwards. Also, the defendant suffered mental and physical abuse by both parents, but the father was often absent because of 4 different families that he had. The defendant was raised, as I've indicated, in a poverty-stricken and violent area of Kingston, Jamaica. The defendant, because again of these various families that Mr. Ritchie's father had, the defendant was the first of 18 siblings and helped raise them. Also, the defendant was gainfully and lawfully employed at various jobs as an adult, at first as a worker at Kingston, at the Kingston Airport, and then at Comtrans Communications making cell phone towers. The defendant also, we will show, and you certainly have heard this friendship, this relationship that he's continued to maintain with Miss Kelly in the course of the first phase of the trial, but that we will present evidence that the defendant was kind and generous to others and possesses other positive redeeming qualities. And then finally, the defendant displays a low risk of recidivism. And you will hear testimony from Mr. Land as well as Dr. Eisenstein regarding that point. I believe, ladies and gentlemen, these mitigating factors will outweigh any aggravating factors that have been presented. Most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, I believe these mitigating factors will warrant a decision on your part that life imprisonment is the appropriate sentence in this case. Please keep an open mind. And remember, mitigating factors do not have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Only by the greater weight of the evidence, which is basically more likely than not. Ladies and gentlemen, upon the conclusion of this portion of the case of the evidence, I submit to you that you will determine that the appropriate sentence is a life sentence regarding Mr. Granville Ritchie. Thank you.